So Dr. Patrick, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Chaudhary Sensei. I appreciate the introduction, and it's a pleasure to be back with you. Today, I will be talking. I'm going to share my screen here. About instructional design in university education, although I'm going to be pulling in some experiences I've had even at the high school level to undertake this presentation. You know who I am. I'm Dr. Patrick Doherty. Everyone kind of knows me as Dr. Pat. You're welcome to call me Dr. Pat or just Pat if you like. There's no problem here. And so instructional design is something that a lot of people are occasionally intimidated by, because they think that it's something different that they have never dealt with, that they would have to learn. But actually, as we experience our lives as educators, we all are already involved in instructional design. When you design your lessons, when you design your units, when you design your curricula, you are involved in instructional design. So maybe what I'm trying to do here today is maybe take away, the curtain a bit, so that you see the things that you've always been doing, and maybe then can put a name to them, because we're going to talk about different instructional design methodologies. And I'm glad you have the document that you can ask questions on. I will provide some opportunity at the end to answer your questions and have a bit of a discussion. But first, I'm going to kind of go through my presentation. So I'm putting on my professor hat here. The agenda, introduction, of course, differences in definitions so that you understand what we are talking about when we talk about instructional design. I'll give you examples of use, because I want you to understand how these have been used, these different methodologies. There are 5 of them I'll introduce, kind of the 5 big ones, but they're not the only ones out there. So recognize that also. But I'm going to show you how I have used each of those at different points in my career and for different events or different facing different educational challenges. Then, of course, our conclusion will be lead into a Q&A session for everyone. You know that I am the Dean of Faculty, which also puts me in charge of basically faculty development. And I work with, we're blessed to have a young faculty. A lot of people, this is the first opportunity at AIU, is their first job basically in academia. So they are eager to learn and that. And so I've been very happy with working in my position as Dean, because it does provide me with that opportunity to work directly with the faculty. I'm also head of the English for Academic Purposes program, which is our foundational program. And then I'm also director of the Active Learning Center, Active Learning and Assessment Center. So in different ways, I interact with the students, who I like to call young scholars, and the faculty. So I believe my position here is very rich in opportunities to interact with people at all different stages of their lives, careers, and academic experiences. I have been an educator for a long time. It's actually, I was thinking about 34, 35 years now. So and the time has passed quickly, it seems. But I have been privileged to be able to work in different settings and with different cultures. So I worked in the United States, initially down in the southwest of the US in a place called Phoenix, Arizona, where most of my students in the high school, where I started my career back in the 80s as a high school teacher, most of them were actually originally, their families were from Mexico or Latin America. Most of them were native Spanish speakers. Even those who had been born in the United States, they tended to be using Spanish as a language at home. And so I'll talk a little bit about that as we go forward. I have also, of course, worked in Japan a total of 20 years at different stages. 20 years I've worked in Japan at different stages. First, in the 90s, I spent 2 years here as an exchange teacher, because Phoenix had a sister city in Japan. And then I came back and I worked from 2000 to 2008. And then I went to the United Arab Emirates and I stayed there and worked in Abu Dhabi and different locations for about 5 years. And then I've come back to Japan and I've been working at Akita International University since the fall of 2013. So going on about 9 years. I've also worked in Bangladesh, both as a researcher, but also I taught. I taught a series of creative writing courses at a university in Dhaka. And I got a lot of research out of those experiences as well. And I've taught, at the high school level, at the undergraduate level, and at the graduate level. So I've been very blessed to be able to have a kind of a multivariated career. It's taken me around the world, and I've been able to work with literally thousands of other educators and probably tens of thousands of young scholars over my 34 years. Now, of course, I work at Akita International University in Akita, Japan. Why is Akita kind of unique? Well, first, it's an international university in a way, and it's a EMI institution. So we conduct all of our classes, except for our language courses like Spanish, French, and that, in English. I should say that we have a large number of international scholars who come on exchange or they come to seek degrees. So we also provide Japanese language courses for those learning Japanese, but everything, our lingua franca on the campus is English. And we are up in a very pretty place up in the north of Japan called Akita, hence Akita International University. And because we're up in the north, we get, it's a very nice climate. It's very rural. It's very rugged. We have mountain ranges. We have, glacial lakes, basically. We're in a temperate rainforest. We get a lot of rain, but that also means we have a lot of lakes and rivers and streams. It's a beautiful place. It has 4 seasons, all right? My wife doesn't quite like the winter, but we do have a beautiful winter, I think. And fortunately, my daughters like skiing and snowboarding, so there are plenty of opportunities to do that. So it's a very pretty place, very rural. I want to just mention, although a lot of you already know this, that what brought me to Bangladesh the first time, and repeating, has been Teachers Helping Teachers. And some of you might have attended some of our programs for Teachers Helping Teachers. The last 2 years, we've done them virtually because of the pandemic, but we're hoping that maybe this year we can actually bring them back in person, but we'll see how it goes. But Teachers Helping Teachers started in Bangladesh, actually, back in 2005, but we're also active in the Philippines, Laos, Vietnam, Nepal, and Kyrgyzstan. So we do teacher training programs. This is a picture from the very first teacher training program we did back in 2005. You can see I didn't even have hair back then. So anyway, let me talk a little bit about instructional design. It's something that you do almost every day, maybe without recognizing it, but you do it because you design lessons. You design units, you design your curricula, and in doing that, designing, you are actually being an instructional designer. One thing I want to point out too is when we talk about instructional design, it's not just for what we would consider regular education, like K through 12 education and university education. Instructional designers work in industry as well. They design materials to help, train people, for example. So if you have a sales force and they need training, you might seek the help of an instructional designer to create a training program for them. So it's not just unique to education. And actually, when I was going through my doctorate in the United States, a few of my fellow doctoral candidates were actually studying instructional design, and they were working in industry. So it's not just unique to education per se. It's something that permeates any situation where you need to educate, to train, to teach. Okay. And there are theoretical pinnings to this, but I don't want to go too deep into theory with this. I want it to be more of a practical experience where you can see how I've utilized different types of instructional design in the real world as an educator, okay? And in a very real way, instructional design deals with solving educational or instructional problems. I'll talk about that. So if you have an issue in your classroom, you might need to utilize instructional design to try to deal with that issue, that problem, or that challenge. It deals with the teaching and learning ecosystem, how we teach and how people learn. And it encourages, I think, active and engaged learning because you go through a thought process. And there's a loop of feedback in most of the systems of instructional design that I will cover with you, so that you can kind of think deeply about how you are structuring your educational events, opportunities for your students, and how successful those are, and if the young scholars, the students, are learning. And instructional design supports faculty, I think, to be more effective in the classroom. As I look back at my career, when I really deeply thought about what I was doing in the classroom, that's when I became more effective. Let's face it, when you first start teaching, a lot of times you're just trying to survive, right? But as you kind of mature as an educator and you have the space of time and also understanding, then you can truly utilize instructional design to benefit your young scholars in the classroom. And there are some differences, and I just want to point out, because sometimes people get confused between the difference between what we call learning design and instructional design. Okay, now learning design, there's similarities, but think of it on a smaller scale. It's basically like, okay, let's say I'm working, for example, at AIU, and I do teach several lit courses as well as several English skills courses during the year. And so let's say I've been teaching a lit course, and I've had a very successful lesson where I've had, the young scholars discussing Orwell and Orwell's life and how it might have impacted his creation of 1984. And so I share this with one of the other lit teachers who might be teaching another set of books, but the experience was useful. And so I go through and say, this is how I set up, this is a learning task and that. So, just basically looking on a smaller scale. Instructional design, though, refers to more of a I want to go back to learning design for a second. There's not exactly reflection in it. It's more like, oh, this worked. Oh, here you go. You explain how it worked. And then instructional design actually refers to more of a reflective process where you're thinking through and you're retooling and you're going back maybe over and over again. And as educators, we do this, don't we? We teach the same courses year after year, semester after semester. And so maybe, depending on our context, we have the luxury of being able to go back and rethink how we approach things. I had to go through and retool everything for the pandemic. When we went from being in person to online, of course, I could carry over some things, but really I had to restructure my whole approach. And I think everybody did. So we were involved in, well, in a way, at first learning design, because you say, did this work? Yes, we survived. To instructional design, because the pandemic continued and we had time after a few semesters to kind of really perfect what we were trying to do. So that feedback loop is important in instructional design, and each of the systems I will show you has, in a way, a feedback loop where we're reflecting and thinking, okay, maybe we can retool this, maybe we can make this better. This did not work so well, judging from the student responses on in the focus group. And so we have then the luxury of being able to go back and redo things. And there's a website called Instructional Design Central that I really like. I go to it from time to time. And they say that instructional design is the process by which learning products and experiences are designed, where you think, okay, how do I want my kids to learn, my young scholars, and then designing those opportunities for them, and then how it's developed and how it's delivered. They also say instructional design is creating learning or instructional experiences that facilitate the acquisition of new knowledge. Now, we all do this, don't we? So we all are, in a way, instructional designers from the get-go as educators. Now, principal concern regarding university education, instructional design helps to ensure that professors, all of us, are giving effective lessons and that their students, I like to call them scholars, their young scholars are comprehending what is being taught. So this feedback loop also helps us to make sure that what we are doing is being effective in the classroom. So it's not a one-off thing. We come back to it time and time again. That's the idea and ideal of instructional design. So what are the elements of it? You, of course, need, like always, educational goals and objectives. What do you want your young people to learn? What are the objectives? You know, you need to give careful thought to this and decide these are the things. Now, sometimes, for example, if you're in a high school environment or junior high or elementary school, perhaps you have the curriculum given to you. You know, the state says in America, this is what we want our kids to learn. All right. And the freedom the teacher has then is trying to figure out how to actualize that, how to take the state-sponsored curriculum and make it applicable to the classroom setting, wherever that classroom setting might be. And I think most states that are reasonable in the United States will understand that, you know, you might have rural environments in your state, you might have urban, you have different, you know, population centers, different challenges in each of those population centers. So the curriculum is there, but then the teachers have a lot of freedom, ideally, to kind of figure out for their group of young scholars, their students, what would work best as far as events, as far as supporting activities, to make sure that the kids do learn the curriculum. Now, in the university level, we generally have much more freedom, don't we? Especially if we're teaching electives. Now, when we talk about, you know, foundations programs like the English for Academic Purposes program I work with, I supervise, naturally, we have multiple sections of each course, and so the faculty have to kind of agree on how to make the approach and what the curriculum. But you know, there's freedom, but they just need to debate, discuss, and you know, I tell them I want them to come up with consensus, and then figure out fair ways to, you know, proceed in the classroom. Each teacher can kind of, you know, go a little bit off this way or that way, depending on their passions. But generally, we've got to have like the same types of assessments, the same general lesson objectives and that. So that happens. But for example, in my literature courses I teach and my rhetoric courses that I teach, I have complete control. You know, I can select the books, I can select what I'm doing and all of that. And there's freedom in that that is wonderful sometimes, but also a challenge in itself. Three, and then you have activities, events, projects, support of the educational goals, and then you have assessments. Now, assessments don't need to be tests. They can be other things going on that you can use, especially in the younger grades. You know, my sister's a retired elementary school teacher. She taught second grade and first grade for like 32 years, 33 years. And she had a way of assessing whether her young little charges were understanding things and getting things, you know, raising their hands or doing this, or just she would just pay attention to them. Maybe we don't have that luxury at the higher grades where we have more students, basically. You know, for example, I teach one lit course in the winter, and I had 116 students in it this last winter. So it's hard to, you know, so sometimes you have to rely on tests and assessments or quizzes and things as well. But I just want you to recognize that when I talk about assessment, it isn't necessarily only a test per se. So you have your goals and objectives, you have your activities and events that support the learning and reaching of those goals and objectives. And then you have some format of assessing whether or not they got it, whether or not your young scholars understand what you were trying to teach. And then there's this feedback loop in instructional design that allows you to go back and retool things next time, you know, next time. And there's something called the magic triangle in instructional design lingo, that's what they mean when this is what they mean. You have your objectives, you have your learning activities, and you have your assessments. That's basically the same thing I showed you in a linear path, but they kind of like this magic triangle. So if you hear that, this is what they're talking about. The objectives for the course, what you want to teach, the learning activities you come up with to support those objectives, and then how you assess whether or not those objectives were met. You know, what is the archive of success, or the artifact of success, I should say. And yes, instructional design is linked to educational learning theory, but in this presentation, I don't want to get too tied into it, but it is an essential thing. But I could have course after course after course on these concepts. Behaviorism, you might be familiar with that. It's basically where you're not so concerned with what's going on in the brain of the student per se, in the sense you're thinking about the cognitive process. You're basically paying attention to the nuts and bolts. Okay, this is the input, and then what is the output? And you judge from the output whether or not the input was successful. So you're not really looking at, you're looking at the behavior of the student. Are they being successful in producing what you wanted them to produce? If so, great. Cognitivism, think cognition, is the mind is kind of a computer. Now, computers are interesting because they always kind of layer the learning on or understanding on other things. So new information is coded in a way and then integrated with existing knowledge. So it's like a mosaic almost, where you decide, okay, this piece of glass looks lovely next to that piece of glass, and things seem to fit together, and you have understanding that way. Constructivism means that the individual learner will construct from their own experience, their own understanding of reality and their understanding. So learning is not objective. Each learner develops their own reality to understand what is being taught. They fit it into their own framework of understanding. So these are the three big learning theories. There are others, and yes, instructional design is linked to these theories. But again, I don't want us to get too bogged down in the discussion of theories. So that's that. But just understand that there is a relationship, okay? I mean, rarely also is somebody just purely a behaviorist or purely a constructivist. We kind of like mix all of that together a lot of times when we are in the practical situation of the classroom. But instructional design is related to theory in a way, and theory is related to instructional design as far as how they interact with each other. There are, as I said, 5 instructional design models that I want to introduce today. These are not the only ones. There are others, but these are kind of the big ones, the ones that maybe you hear of a lot in instructional design circles. And again, as educators, we tend to blend these. We tend to use pieces of them. In other words, occasionally it's not just a pure, oh, I'm using Bloom's taxonomy only. I'm using the ADDIE model only. Okay, but we have these general 5 instructional design models. Bloom's taxonomy, which you probably have heard of, the ADDIE model, Iterative Design, the SAM model, which is actually kind of a simplified version of the ADDIE model, and something called Learning Circle Framework. Okay, so those are the 5 that I'm going to try to talk about a little bit. So I think most of us have probably had some experience with Bloom's taxonomy. It's basically a hierarchical ordering of cognitive skills, and it can help teachers teach and students learn, you know, if we understand it. So this is from the 2001. It's, you know, Bloom's taxonomy came out in the 1950s, but it has been retooled in the 2000s, taking the nouns that were used originally for each of these levels and making them into verbs. So, you know, you start off with the basics of remembering things. You know, you want your students to remember the multiplication tables, for example, and then understanding, where maybe they're grasping a concept you're trying to get across. So at these 2 points, yes, there is interaction, but it's basically they're being passive. the student is being passive. They're remembering, they're understanding. But then applying, analyzing, evaluating, creating, these are where they become involved, engaged, and they are called the higher order thinking skills, I think, because of that, because they are using those to do something, okay? And by the way, as I mentioned, 1956, they tended to have nouns like knowledge, comprehension, application, analysis, synthesis, evaluation. In the 2000s, they've kind of decided to change them into verb form. So we have remember, understand, apply, analyze, evaluate, and create. Okay. Again, I think part of that ethos is that we want engagement and activity. So that's that. Then we have the ADDIE model. And ADDIE is you have analysis, you have design, you have development, you have implementation, and you have evaluation. They kind of go in a circle, although often you will see it shown as a waterfall graph instead, even though the evaluation should then go back up. But analysis, you think about the problem, the issue, and I will give you examples, don't worry, as we go forward. Then you design something, you know, a curriculum, an event, an activity, a lesson, and then you develop it. You actually go through the nuts and bolts of creating it. We design lessons, but we still need to maybe, you know, select readings or do this or that to develop them. Then you implement it, the lesson, the curriculum, the event, and then you evaluate. How did it go? And how do you evaluate? Maybe I use focus groups. I also look at what was produced by the young scholars. I sit there and I think about things, and then I go back and maybe I redo it. I do it again. Iterative design is an approach of incrementally developing and refining design. This is where you have some luxury of time. And I think at the university level, often we do, not always, but because I've been teaching, for example, a couple of my lit courses for 9 years. So, okay, I've had time to go back and retool and redesign. I didn't have the luxury when we had to get ready for online education. That was like literally only 2 or 3 weeks, and then suddenly, boom, we had to go into the digital classroom. So there wasn't a luxury of time. But if you have the luxury of time, this is a design format that can be utilized. It's got several components. Planning, you think about the requirements maybe of the curriculum or what the government's saying the kids should learn. Then you analysis and design. You figure, okay, how can we approach this? It's great if you can use colleagues in this process. And by the way, as I will mention later, these design systems may be used by individual educators. They may be used by departments. They may be used by, by educational institutions. They can expand or contract. They don't need to just be used by one person. Okay, so you could have a whole department going through this process. And I have a chat here. Just let me see if there's. Oh, okay. You're just sharing the Google Doc again. Okay, so anyway, again, they can be used by individual educators or by departments or by institutions or by whole governmental systems if necessary. And then you have your implementation, and then you have your testing, your evaluation. Then you kind of go around and around and around. Again, there should be this refining, which requires analysis, which requires reflection and retooling. And then we have the SAM model, Successive Approximation Model is what it's called. To me, it's kind of a simplified version of the ADDIE model, okay? And maybe it's an earlier feedback loop, and maybe it's very useful if you don't have much time, okay? But you still want to do a good job of designing your lessons, your unit and that, and you're just trying to very quickly, it's an attenuated ADDIE model almost. So you evaluate, design, and develop, okay? That's what you do. And like to example here, ADDIE model on the left and the SAM model on the right, ADDIE has evaluate, analyze, design, develop, implement, go into a cycle. But here you have evaluate, design, develop, just quicker. It's where you have to make decisions rapidly, like we did when we had to go from being in the classroom to suddenly being online. We just had to get going. And then you have the last of the 5 that I'm going to introduce, the learning circle framework. It's a circle. You analyze, you strategize, you implement, and you evaluate. Now, you might say, how is that not similar to the SAM? Well, I think the strategizing is part of that because it's where you're really trying to, I tend to think about this as more where you have groups of teachers working together, but it doesn't need to be. You can be an individual teacher. I'll show you how I used it, how we used it also. But you analyze a problem, you're looking at your class, you're thinking about your students, you figuring out, okay, they had this problem last year with this curriculum. What can I do to change it? And you strategize, try to figure out a way. Maybe it's your own class, but you talk to other people about it. Then you implement what you came up with, then you evaluate, and then you go back if you have to. And usually you have to, let's face it. Every semester is different. Every group of young scholars is different. Okay, so in reality, many faculty use bits and pieces of these systems and others. Rarely are we just pure like, I'm just going to use the SAM model. I'm just going to use the ADDIE model. We tend to think also like, oh, Bloom's taxonomy, I want them to be working with a higher order thinking skills. And then, oh, I'm going to use the SAM model here. So it tends to be blended a lot, and that's fine. That's okay. Now, the systems that I said may be used by individual faculty, by faculty teams, or by entire academic systems. I mean, and then as I mentioned, also in industry. So it's not just, these aren't isolated only to educational settings per se, classic educational settings. So they initiate, as you initiate new courses, curricular educational initiatives, or retooling old courses curricular, or revisiting educational initiatives, you can use these systems. Now, I promised you some examples from my experience. So this is my storytelling time, I suppose. Instructional design in my early teaching experience, I became an educator in the 1980s, before computers were used, before there was an internet that was accessible. We used chalkboards and textbooks and paper. We did have overheads. Those were kind of cool. We did have those when I started out. And we had Xerox machines, but they didn't like us to use the Xerox machine. It was expensive. So we tend to use those little mimeograph machines that you had to kind of, have the barrel that you turned, and you had you wrote things out usually, or typed them, and then those were put on this. Usually it was red. I remember that red ink, and it would get everywhere. But so that was when I started teaching. Some of you might have started way back in the 80s also, so you know what I'm talking about. I started my career as an educator. I mean, after my degree, I was working for the Bureau of Indian Affairs as a tutor, but I started as a teacher at Carl Hayden High School in Phoenix, Arizona. Now, Carl Hayden was an urban school. We had about 3,500 students at it. It was a school that had, well, one way we know that it was an impoverished area, our free and reduced lunch program was basically what everybody used because it was in an impoverished environment. The neighborhood was kind of dangerous. People got shot in the neighborhood. 3 weeks into my teaching there, I saw a drive-by shooting. I mean, it was just the reality. We had a lot of teen pregnancy, lots of issues. Drug abuse, homeless students, but I chose to work there because I honestly, as a young educator, wanted to change the world. And so I chose to go to an urban school, even though I had graduated from a rural school myself back in the Midwest, because I felt I wanted to help people. I was an idealist, like I think a lot of us are when we're that age. You later discover changing the world is almost impossible. It's even hard to change the block or the street or something, And there I am, my first year teaching. All that lovely hair, where did that go? But anyway, as I mentioned, the school had issues. For example, I was first hired to teach social studies and English. I later got trained to teach and certified to teach ESL, English as a second language. But at the beginning, I was teaching English, composition, and some reading, lit courses, and I was also teaching history. One of my first master's degree was actually in history. But what I discovered, for example, if I had a 10th grade, a year 10 world history class, and the textbook was written for year 10. We could flesh Kincaid it out to year 10, but I discovered that my young scholars in most of my classes, they were reading far, far below grade level. So even like year 2, year 3, year 5. So the textbooks were just too difficult for them. Also, there was not a lot of academic support. I mean, I have to be honest, it was kind of like when I got hired there, the principal, who was a nice fellow, basically said, okay, there are your textbooks, your classrooms over there. Good luck, kid. That was kind of my send off. And so there wasn't a lot. I had to reach out myself, and I did. I realized that I needed help with the reading. So I reached out to, we had a reading specialist on campus, just one for 3,500 students. That was crazy. They should have had just exponentially more, but she did help. I mean, I said, listen, these kids don't know how to read very well. What can I do? So I got some support, but I had to reach out for it, and I had to decide what to do. And then I did have access to a new technology. Now, what did I do? I'll use the example of my world history class, even though all of them I had to do this. I rewrote the textbook. I took each unit and I took the textbook and I kind of simplified it. And I wrote a 2-page summary of what the textbook, chapter. So we have a chapter on ancient Egypt. Okay, it might go on for like 10, 12, 13 pages. I would make a simple 2-page flesh Kincaided. This is one thing the reading teacher, I'd heard of flesh Kincaid, but she showed me how to do it. This is before the internet. So to try to figure out what grade level. So I would try to reduce the grade level. I wanted to challenge them to improve their reading, but I didn't want to lose them either. So I tried to aim it for about year 6. So about 4 years below grade level, but where I felt I could kind of raise them up a bit. And so I did that. I rewrote the whole textbook, each chapter having a 2-page summary that I would then read with the kids. So we'd actually sit there and I get them into reading groups, and I didn't ask them to read out loud unless they wanted to. I always made, if there were volunteers, but I don't want to put them on the spot. And I would read with them. And we had vocabulary. I took vocabulary that I would have them, I wanted them to understand from the reading. I put the vocabulary on cards around the classroom. We had little activities I designed where the kids would okay, how can we use this word in a different sentence and things like that. And so I tried to be supportive of their reading needs, because I realized, yes, I was supposed to teach them history, but if I didn't deal with their reading, they were not going to be able to succeed there at that institution. So I figured, okay, I got to be a reading teacher too. No problem. I took that hat on. And then I did have access to a quote unquote new technology, video. The video cameras became popular way back when. They were very expensive at the time I started teaching. They were huge. They were like Hollywood cameras, but they had the VHS tapes. Remember those? And so I discovered that my students, my young scholars, really thought it was cool if we could use a video, make a video in the classroom. So what do? We actually made little tiny plays. I like, for example, ancient Egypt or Rome, or when I went into the Renaissance, we would take a character and we would write a little script, just a simple little 10-minute play. And the kids kind of got into this. And so like in the Roman era, they would, we would get them draped in sheets. So they had togas, and they would write this themselves, of course, with my help. And then we would act out with the video camera, the scene. like for example, there was one about Tutankhamun and his wife. I remember that. We did one with Julius Caesar coming into Rome. We did one with Galilei. So we had these different scenes, and the kids really got into this. And what we do is we'd make the video, and then the following week I would show the video and use that as kind of a way to remind them about what we covered in class. But they seemed to really like it, and it got them energized. And so they were looking forward to coming to history class, which a lot of them would admit at the beginning they did not really like history or that, but they got into it because I was able to do these things. So that was my instructional design. It was called the Learning Circle Framework. I basically analyzed the problem. They're not reading at grade level. And because of that, I think a lot of them kind of gave up. They knew they weren't good at reading, and they didn't have the support, unfortunately, in the system to improve their reading. And there were no books at home or things like that. But within the context of my classroom, which was the only place I really had control, I analyzed the problem and I came up and I strategized. I figured, okay, I've got to rewrite the textbook. And I sought out help from the reading teacher, the reading specialist, to kind of with that strategization. And then I implemented the two things. I had my own little, summaries that I use in lieu of the reading of the textbook. And I also introduced the video, which got the kids a chance to kind of really engage with the material in a fun way that they seemed to enjoy, but they were learning. They were writing the little plays. So they had to actually study a bit to figure out what was going on way back when, so they could make a play about it. And then I evaluated whether or not it was successful. And my evaluation wasn't just on, okay, they're reading better. It was also on they were attending more, because attendance was an issue in the inner city. And so my kids were showing up. Some of them would even tell me, oh, I was late or this, that. I didn't go to my first two classes, but I didn't want to miss yours. So I saw that as something that was part of the evaluation. They were energized and engaged with the material, the history material. They were learning. They were improving their vocabularies. They were reading, so that was all important. So I used the Learning Circle framework for that. Now, that was when I was a high school teacher, 1,000 years ago, almost 35 years ago, almost 36 years ago now. Instructional design, in my experience in the UAE, the United Arab Emirates, I was very privileged. I had a great time working in the UAE and Abu Dhabi and other parts of the Emirate, but my base was in Abu Dhabi. I worked with a huge faculty, and people were from all over the world. And we were teaching primarily Emirati young scholars at the university level. And the challenge they had was that their K-12 in the public schools was conducted in Arabic, but if they're going to study at the university level, the government mandated they had to study in English, except for there was one university that was the Saban. They had a branch of the Saban, I think Abu Dhabi, that was open in Abu Dhabi, and classes were conducted there in French. So the kids had to get used to English. Then, of course, we had a lot of foundational programs for them. One thing I taught and worked with is part of my work there. I later also developed graduate programs, but when I first arrived, it was, I was teaching writing classes, and the kids, the young students, young adults were not motivated to write. I think in any language, not just in English. So I had some experience prior to teaching creative writing. Way back even in the high school level, I taught this, but at the university level, I taught creative writing. And I'll talk about that. So I thought, well, maybe creative writing could be a way I can kind of entice them into writing. It can work with their motivation and help them with skill building. So I use Bloom's taxonomy, especially the thing about creating. And I use ADDIE, the ADDIE system, because I did have a little bit of a benefit of time. So analysis, design, development, implementation, and evaluation. So I spent time thinking about this, working with colleagues and talking about how we could integrate creative writing as a way to motivate. because those of you who might know the UAE culture, traditional culture, very much influenced by poetry, spoken poetry especially. And so it had a culture of creativity, of using language to create beautiful poetry. And so I thought, well, they already have this tradition of creative use of language, so maybe we can kind of bring this into the writing process. So that's what I did. And now I mentioned that I'd done some research on this, had experiences, and yes, in Bangladesh. You might recognize Gulshan there. This is from years ago, this picture. But I was teaching at a university there on a grant, basically. And so for 3 years, I went back and I would teach a course. And then I went back again in 2014 to kind of reprise it. But for 3 years in the early aughts, I taught with using it kind of as a laboratory. I taught creative writing in English, okay, to, well, non-native speakers of English. And there are some pictures here you can see. So these started way back when, 2006, 2007, 2008. And the university I was working with gave me an office, gave me classrooms, helped me, get the young scholars. We also created books. So they named it the Young Scholars, and the courses named it Deshi Dreams. So we had a couple of volumes, I think 3 volumes total. These are the first 2. And then I took that experience, which I had done research on, and I published several papers on it. And I decided, hey, maybe I can utilize, and maybe that was one reason why they were willing to experiment with this, because I could relate back to my experience in Bangladesh and the research that I'd done. So I could say, listen, this is what my research showed me, that it is motivational, that people do want to write more if they've had this opportunity to be creative with the language. And so I introduced it to the United Arab Emirates. And what did we do? Between 2009 and 2013, I arrived in 2009, I left in 2013, just under 5 years. I developed a creative writing English curriculum for undergraduates. And it wasn't just me. Okay, maybe I was a motivational force, but I had a lot of help, and we did a lot of discussions with faculty. And we started what turned out to be the very first poetry slam in the Middle East, as far as I understand. A poetry slam, if you don't know what it is, it's a competition. It's a poetry competition. And this actually fit very well with the traditional culture in Bangladesh, where there was kind of a poetic, competition going on. And so the young scholars would write poetry in English, and then they would recite it. So we had these poetry slams. And then what I would do is I would make an anthology. I called it the Sundial Poets, because in the middle of the campus, there was this big sundial. And, it became an event. We would have cake. We would have judges. We would invite people from the community. We would videotape, because a lot of the kids said, especially the young men, liked to be videotaped, when they were doing their poetry. So that was fine. They gave us permission. We did it. And it improved, I would say, it improved their attitude towards the writing courses. They had fun with this. They had a sense of accomplishment because their poetry and their short stories were appearing in the Sundial Poets. So that was good. And then how did I kind of judge whether things were going well? I did surveys of the young scholars. I had focus groups. I looked, of course, at their literary output and musings with my, my own musings, but also where I was talking to the faculty about how did it work? How did it go? Did it, and we were generally very satisfied with what was happening because of this. In fact, when I left in 2013, I'm gratified to know, at least for a while, they kept the poetry slams going. So I can't tell you if it's still happening now, but for a while it continued on, at least. Most of the people I worked with directly have retired or moved on, so I don't have the contacts back at the universities that I used to have. And then instructional design and my experience in Japan. Of course, I've been, like I mentioned, at different times. If you put it all together, I've worked in Japan for 20 years. I'm still trying to master the language. One day I will do that, maybe in retirement when I have more time. It's a beautiful language, but very, very, very complicated writing system. Very complicated, but the grammar isn't so bad. But the writing system, the reading is very challenging. But anyway, that's my perpetual task. Okay, so the issue. I work at a liberal arts university. Liberal arts universities are rare in Japan, especially public universities, like mine. This is a public university I work at. It's a prefectural university. And so I come here, and one of the attractions to AIU for me, Akita International University, was it was a liberal arts university. I went to a liberal arts university for my undergraduate studies, and I absolutely loved it, and so I thought, oh, liberal arts, this is great. I want to do this. And so after I arrived, though, and they brought me in as the supervisor or head of the English for Academic Purposes program. And that I discovered very quickly that most of our young scholars, when I arrived, did not really know what the liberal arts were. They had no idea of their history or the importance of the institution or to their lives. So I said, this is wrong. They need to be aware of the liberal arts. They need to know what this university is based on. So I use the SAM model in this case, successive approximation model. Very simple, but I felt something needed to happen, and it needed to happen quickly. And so I came up with, along with others, maybe I was a spur for this, but I had lots and lots of help, the Liberal Arts Workshop Series. So what was it? Well, first off, we wrote a book. Miguel Sosa Sensei wrote the book, I should say. We contributed, but he was the one who really did it. It was a series of readings about the liberal arts. And then we would have, and we have, I'm showing you actually this spring schedule. So May 27th, we'll have a workshop, June 10th, June 24th, and July 1st, we're gonna have team presentations. So they're basically 4 meetings, with the last one being something of an assessment. And this are the contents of the textbook that we developed. Okay, so we have introduction, overture, acknowledgements. We talk about the 3 stages of reading, because of course we're dealing with kids who are reading at academic works in English, many of them for the first time at this level. And then you can see that we have 6 chapters, each of them dealing with an aspect of the liberal arts. The purpose, knowing and understanding what the liberal arts is, wisdom without answers, the need to be open-minded and understanding that not everything will have a clear answer. From knowledge to understanding, moving from simply knowing something about something to understanding what it is. Creativity, because that is a key, I think, to the liberal arts. And then why the liberal arts is important. Because oftentimes liberal arts programs are thought of as kind of, oh, it's something extra. It's not serious. It's like, we want business and engineering and science and all of that. But I think in the United States, and in one way I have lots of criticisms of education in the US, but one thing that I will say is positive is that even if you're studying business, for example, or engineering, most universities, most state universities at least, require that you have some basic courses first. And those basic courses are often elements of the liberal arts. You have to take you need to take a history course and an English course and this course and that course, and a foreign language. And so all of those things often encourage are parts of the liberal arts, even if people don't acknowledge it or recognize it or understand it to be. So the liberal arts do kind of infuse at least the first 2 years of most educational, environments in the United States for the university level. And I'm just going to kind of show you a little bit about, the curriculum and what we try to do. I usually start off, by showing the young scholars this picture, this etching, and I ask them, what is the artist trying to say? And they come up with all sorts of interesting things about discovery and going beyond what the surface of things and understanding how things actually work, and being an adventurer in the sense of, intellectually, and discovery, all of that. So it's kind of fun. It opens up a lot of interesting opening discussions. And I do share a quote with them, and I always point out these words. Okay, this is about liberal arts, but it always points at, well, engaged and student-centered. Okay, so student-centered and engaged. So these are the things that are important in the liberal arts. And then we have our liberal arts workshops. And now this is pre-pandemic, and we're hoping we're going to keep the liberal arts workshops online this semester, but we're hopeful that we can go back to face-to-face in the fall, but we'll see. Right now, our classes are being conducted face-to-face. We kind of reintroduced that this term, but we're very cautious with it. So, in the liberal arts workshops, I have, about 180 scholars involved, and that's too many to put together in any of our rooms because we're still trying to keep social distancing. So we'll see. But we've been successful for the last 2 years, each semester doing this online, but we're hoping we can go back. So they have a curriculum that they go through. They read the text, then they discuss it, and I go through a bunch of questions that we have for each of these, and I'm just going to share to give you an idea. So from the readings, they have to come up with like one good reason young people should study history or literature or philosophy or music or art or computer science. Studying something outside of the major. Is it important to study something? If you're going to study engineering, become an engineer, should you also study art? Would it be beneficial if you study music? And so they discuss this. We talk about developing habits, like habits of thought, and that we talk about, because we part of our motto is that we make global leaders. So at AIU, we talk about how is this ordered intellect that's mentioned in the reading related to being a global leader. And so they go through, and we have this whole curriculum that we have developed over the years, but it started off with the simple truth that our young scholars did not understand what the liberal arts was, and we wanted them to understand. So we worked out a system, we came up with a textbook, and then we created a curriculum to support that, and we analyze it every semester. Okay, every semester we have quotes and things. Okay, so you get that idea. But our assessment per se, now we also do focus groups and things, but what do they have to produce at the end? What is the artifact of success? We usually do this as a team project because we have like 180 at a time, young scholars, but they have to go through the book, the text that we assign them to read. And they have to find something, a quote or a poem, and then they have to tell us what you think this quote or poem means in terms of liberal arts education in general, how the information of the quote or poem applies to your experiences at AIU, and then what you think this quote or poem means in terms of your futures, okay? And so then they do a presentation. This is a picture from spring 2017. So we've been doing this for a while. And we originally did them as poster presentations, although now we do them as a PowerPoint because we've moved online. But again, we might go back to the poster presentation. Those are always kind of fun. And you can see, okay, this is a quote. Creative people are, in essence, flexible, often exhibiting a childlike, insatiable curiosity. They took that from the readings. And then they had to go through, their reasons and that. And they made a presentation of about 10 minutes or so, in English, of course. And so that's what we did. And then I have a team of teachers who kind of help me, and we give them, feedback on this. It's kind of a pass-fail for the workshops, but they have to do this, and it has to be adequately done. And they get feedback from the teachers. And the teachers aren't always like EAP or English teachers. I invite people from the business department and people from the philosophy and from all different things, because I think it's just kind of like, okay, well, it's good for them to be giving these presentations. And so we have them in teams, and then they're, the teachers listen, but also, we do it in such a way so they have an audience of their peers as well. And I often invite people who are, upper division young scholars, sophomores, juniors, seniors, to come and listen. And so it's a nice event. We do spring and in the fall. So that is one thing that we did. And now I also want to talk about this just for the heck of it, because it's another thing that I wanted to change the mindset. Most of our young scholars, our students at AIU, they come through the K-12 Japanese system. And I love the system in a lot of ways, especially in elementary school. My kids went through it. But when it gets to junior high and high school, elementary school in Japan is almost like the Montessori system. There's lots of discovery and activities and this and that. And then in junior high, the kids put on uniforms. They actually have to test into a junior high in some cases. They definitely have to test into a high school. And they put on uniforms and things become a bit regimented. And I taught in Japanese high schools for a total of 5 years. So I know what I'm talking about. You got 40 kids in a room. There's not much interaction. Even in a language classroom, it's basically teacher-centric. Kids sit there. The perfect student in that case is a quiet kid who takes notes and regurgitates information on a test. So when they get to AIU in the liberal arts, we want them to be engaged. We want them to ask questions. So we had to change their mindset. Their paradigm had to shift. And so I tried to do that by talking to them when they arrive about being an AIU scholar, that we don't want them to be a student anymore. We want them to be a scholar. And I tell them what I mean. That a student is passive, a student sits there, and the kids understand where I'm going with this because they came through the K-12 system. And, you know, that's what usually results. You're not engaged, you're not interested, and you're not really learning. Maybe you memorize some things, but then the information disappears right after the test. Instead, we want you to be active. We want you to be engaged. We want you to be a scholar. Think about it, a scholar. You know, you ask questions. A scholar, you know, comes up with theories. A scholar does research, and tries to defend what he, she, or they believe. You're very active, and that's the thing. So I tell them, I want you to be scholars. So we call them scholars now. I always call them scholars. I say, dear scholars, if I have to send out an email. Again, we're trying to change the mindset that we don't want them to be passive. We want them to be active. So that was an example, again, how we try to change the environment, because, you know, it's all part of liberal arts. If you're not willing to ask questions, be engaged in the classes, discussions, and then you don't have the liberal arts going on successfully. And another example from Japan and from AIU is that in Japan, unfortunately, and some things we don't have control over because we're a public institution, and there is a Ministry of Education, and there are lots of regulations and rules that come down from that august body in Tokyo. And one thing we have is in our EAP program, the kids all take writing classes, reading classes, and speaking and listening classes. They were completely separate when I arrived. And I wanted people to have at least a point where everything would intersect. Everything would come together. They would use all the skills together to do something. And so we developed, using Iterative Design, we developed something called the AIU Capstone or Showcase. Now it's become what we call ILA 1, which is Applied International Liberal Arts. It's the first project. We have 4 of them actually for Applied International Liberal Arts. But I had these things that I always tell them to think about. And this is kind of how I introduce ILA to the kids. That we learn, of course, as William Glasser identified, through a lot of different ways, okay? We learn what we read, what we hear, what we see and hear, what we discuss, experience, and teach. And I tell them that this opportunity with this ILA 1, with this capstone, is that you will be able to teach somebody else, which is kind of what scholars do. We learn and we teach. I always kind of point out, you know, we don't want you to be like this. I think this is a picture from the University of Paris, Middle Ages, that we want them to be involved. They also bring in Confucius. You know, Confucius said, I hear, I forget, I see, I remember, I do, and I understand. Engagement, active, being active. And even Chaucer's Oxford scholar, gladly he would learn and gladly teach. Okay, so I tell them, you are going to be scholars. You are going to use scholarship, and you are going to question, come up with a question, an interest, or a problem. You will research and find solutions, and then you will share the learning, because that is what scholars do. Now, each course has a task in the process. Remember, they have a reading class, a speaking and listening class, and a writing class. So in the reading class, they do research. That's where they do the research. Go to the library, go to the digital archives, they do research. Writing class, they write an academic paper of approximately, how many words is it? 2,000, about 2,000 words. And then they have a speaking and listening class where they do academic presentation. Okay. And then this just gives you an idea. At the end of the term, and we do this, of course, in spring and then fall, the kids all have to give presentations in their classes. And then we ask them, you know, the classes themselves to vote on one scholar from their class, their course, their section, that they think did a really brilliant job, not just on the writing, but also on the presentation. And then we invite these young scholars to actually be what we call showcase scholars. And they give their presentation then to the whole campus. And then their writing is put in kind of a little journal that we come up with. And so you can see some of the topics. And the topics are their selection. They talk to their faculty members, their teachers, and they come up with something that interests them that they want to research. So let's look at the first group of presenters: education, punishment, and reward in Japan. Autumn admission in Japan. And in Japan, you are normally admitted to university in April. AIU is different because we have an April and a September admission. Okay, that's rare. But you know, some places are saying we should also, across the board, give people a chance to come into the university system in September. That would be radical in Japan. Self-esteem, education for self-esteem, school uniforms, because in junior high and high school, they have to wear them. In Japan, even public schools, and then the use of plastic. That's just an example of research interests the kids have. Okay, and so they do that, and you know, we have all these different topics, and these are the kids who were selected by their peers in their classes to come and give the presentation again and to have their paper presented. Now, you know, so they have an academic paper like Yumiko's paper here. And then I'm not going to really play much of this. In fact, I don't think we have the sound on, so I'm just going to kind of show you a little bit about what we do. This is what we've been doing the last. Very well for presentations. We need to move on though. So our next presenter. And so, okay. So anyway, you got the idea there. So they do, and this, of course, we were able to videotape this like this. Yumiko gave a good presentation in her class. They also respected her writing and her rationale in her paper. And so she was selected then as one of our, I think we had 30 that semester, showcase presenters. Okay, so, oh, I'm looking at my clock here. Time is going away, and we do want to provide an opportunity for Q&A. So conclusion. Here we are. I've introduced you to instructional design. It's something that I'm sure as I was going through, you were saying, aha, I already do that. And that's really kind of the truth. But maybe if, you know, you'll now understand what you're doing a little bit, you know, clearer, and maybe you'll have other ways then of doing the reflection parts of these different systems. I introduce you to 5 instructional design methodologies. These are kind of the big ones, right? There are others, you know, the Bloom's taxonomy, ADDIE model, Iterative Design, SAM model, and Learning Circle framework. As I told you, you know, you often will blend these. Like I use Bloom's taxonomy and the ADDIE model, I believe, for one of these. So anyway, that's normal, and that's perfectly fine. And then we've examined 5 examples that I gave you, one of each of these methodologies of how instructional design has been used in academic settings. Different countries, different educational environments, but all of them situations where I utilize them. Okay. I have references, a lot of them there. And that is going to be that. Okay, at this point, and oh yeah, we have about, not even 20 minutes maybe, but we have a little bit of time. So I don't know how we want to do this. I do recognize you had that document where people were writing questions, so maybe we could take a look at that. And I could maybe, I could share my, I might try to answer the questions of that. So maybe that's a good point where we can talk about this. Okay. Oh, here's a question. Well, let me go through. I've got two questions in the chat here from a couple of them. So question one, since most of the high schools will not allow teachers with such personal freedom of choice. By the way, the freedom of choice, I think, in the situation at Carl Hayden wasn't that the system didn't want to have control. It's that it couldn't because we were in an urban environment with a lot of problems. And so I think they honestly, when I said that the principal basically said, here are your textbooks, there's your classrooms, good luck, kid. I mean, I think they just kind of, it wasn't that they were giving up. It's just that they were so busy with so many other things that they just said, okay, trust the teachers. You guys, curriculum, here it is, just go figure out a way to do it. And that was a challenge, you know. In some ways, I thought, wow, I wish I had more direction. I wish somebody was telling me what to do. You know, picture yourself as a young teacher. That's a lot of nerve-wracking evenings where I try to figure out what to do the next day in class, and things didn't always work, you know. So how can a creative teacher personally adjust with this reality that there may be compelled to undergo a regimented system? I think even in regimented systems, there is a little wiggle room for a bit of creativity. You know, Japan has a very regimented curriculum, and so for 5 years I had a very regimented curriculum I had to deal with as a high school teacher in Japan. You know, they were just, I mean, they had books that, you know, you had to cover 3 pages each lesson, and this and this, and you were getting the kids ready for entrance exams. So I get it. I understand the nature of that, but I still, when the door was shut, figuratively speaking, I could figure out a way within that to still come up with avenues for my young scholars to be expressive. One thing I did was they had all these wonderful little dialogues, you know, some of them were quite boring, but dialogues in the textbooks, the English language textbooks that we were supposed to use in the high school. So I decided, well, let's take these little dialogues and kind of expand on them. And so I decided in teams, and they would exchange the dialogues, and each team had to like write one more, you know, exchange. It was usually 2 people talking. And then we would kind of like do a little, I like plays, right? So we'd actually set up an opportunity where the kids could select one of the dialogues that we worked on, and they could act it out. You know, okay, they're still dealing with a curriculum, but they're being creative, and then they get a chance to kind of like step up in front and kind of do a fun thing, you know. And so yeah, I do understand when it's very regimented, often you feel like, oh, I can't do anything, but don't give up on it. There's still room for you as an educator and a professional to have some influence on your classroom environment and how you want to approach things. I mean, unless you have somebody right over your shoulder all the time telling you, do it this way, do it that way, then you do have a little bit of freedom, but you have to seize it sometimes. That's what I did when I was a high school teacher in Japan. And again, in the United States, oftentimes, especially now, the curriculum is getting more and more set. Teachers who are still in the classroom that I worked with decades ago, most of them are starting to retire, tell me that it's getting more and more regimented. So they're complaining about that too. But, you know, in the 80s, when I started teaching, mostly because of the school and the challenges it was undergoing, the teachers had a lot of freedom. Some of it was just the freedom to figure out how to survive there. Okay, but so I can't give you a prescription like do this to expand it, but I said look for those little opportunities. They don't need to be huge. They can be just a little bit, have a little bit of creativity, have them do this, have them do that, and you can probably work some things in. If you've read some of Penny Ehr's wonderful little activities and things, maybe get some inspiration from those, because she writes things, or did write things, that you can do in just a couple of minutes. And I think those are sometimes wonderful, because they're little icebreakers or things you can use as you transition from one part of the lesson to another. So, think about that too. Second question. Also, will informal instruction design training limit a teacher's creative judgment in classrooms, and thus limit her ability to attract students the way you could do in Carl Hayden? All right. I don't think it limits at all. In fact, I think Picasso said that, all children are artists, but the challenge is to stay an artist as you get older. So I think the idea of instructional design is giving you a framework whereby you can think about what you're doing, where you can face a challenge and you can kind of strategize a solution, but then also go back and reevaluate whether that things are working. So it just gives you that structure. And it's very much a feedback loop in most cases. Try something, works, doesn't work, think about, why did it work? Maybe I can do things like this in other settings with other students. Why didn't it work? Okay, maybe I have to rethink about, okay, why were they getting lost at this point? Oh, maybe I need more direction at this point in the activity. So those sorts of things. Okay. Can somebody show me the document? I don't know if I can bring it up myself, or if I should do that, but maybe I can. Oh, there it is. Okay, I've got it. Let me share it then. I think I can share it now. There we go. Okay. All right, everyone. I want to be able to see some faces there. So there. So these are the questions you came up with. And time is just rapidly disappearing, but I will continue to try to work through these. And this is a comment. For the teacher's professional development, we consider the feedback loop for being a reflective learner, the teacher. However, evidence from being reflective to reflexive is also necessary. Yes, you do need to, in the classroom, monitor and adjust, right? You have to adjust to things, especially if, I would say maybe not so much at the university level, although that can happen, but oftentimes K-12 education, things happen quickly, kids have trouble, there are issues, and you got to deal with it. How did you make the balance between developed and delivered, between interesting and useful, and also between a hierarchical structure of knowledge? I think what I did was, I always wanted to focus on the higher order thinking skills. Bloom's taxonomy, for me, those last couple of layers where they were actually using what they were learning to do something. In fact, we just changed our syllabus system at AIU, at my university here, and we have an online syllabus where you have to put in all these information, and then so not just our students, but also the community. It's open to everybody. People can just look at our syllabi, as a teacher. And in there, we put in what we call ILA activities and projects, applied international liberal arts project activities and projects, because I told the faculty, and I was in charge of kind of faculty development on this, we wanted them to show through a project or an activity that they do in their classes how our young scholars are actually using their knowledge. And so, for example, the ILA 1 is one of the projects that the kids do that they can show how they're actually applying what they're learning in the classroom. I taught for a while. I'm handing it over to another faculty member for this next fall. I taught a course called Popular Culture in Language Teaching and Learning, because we also have a teacher license program here at our university. So a lot of the future teachers, or those thinking about taking up the profession, take that course. And so one of the projects they have to do is actually create a lesson utilizing everything we talked about in the class. I have a template. They have to kind of like create and then deliver a lesson. Usually it's a language lesson, but it can be a culture lesson too. And normally because most of them want to be English teachers, they will do it in English, English lesson. But I also have people who are interested in maybe teaching Japanese language abroad. And so they might do a simple Japanese lesson for us, but they have to show their understanding of what we've been covering by actually creating and delivering a 45-minute instructional lesson, okay, with an assessment of some sort so that they can show that their objectives, and they have to have objectives and goals, have been met, okay? And what do you think of the current trend of instructional design in university education? I think there needs to be more of it. I think we need to be more aware of what we're doing. One of the, if I can say one thing that is a critique of the way we prepare university faculty, is that we don't, to be honest. In most cases, it's traditionally been thought, oh, you got your PhD, good, you can teach. And I think most of us know that, no, that's not always the case. Just because you're an expert in, you know, Renaissance numerology doesn't mean that you are capable of teaching it effectively to people. And most people become better as they go through. But I think that one of the benefits I've had in my life is that before I became, you know, before I really became a university professor, I had years of experience in the classroom. I went through a training. To be honest, I got my teacher license as a high school teacher after I finished my master's degree, my first one. And I spent 2 semesters basically taking educational courses, learning about educational psychology and all of this. And then I spent very, very importantly, I spent one semester, almost 15 weeks in a classroom working under the supervision of a master teacher. And this guy was great in my case. And he was very strict in a way and wanted, oh yeah, lesson plans and objectives and this and that. And how are you going to assess this? And we talked a lot, and he was, you know, a little rough and gruff, but he was good. He was good at what he did. He'd been teaching for decades, and he taught me how to take all the theories that I was getting and apply them to, you know, getting 14, 15, 16-year-olds to understand world history, history of American West, you know, this, that. So it was good. So I think we need more awareness of instructional design at the university levels. It will help us. I kind of do it surreptitiously in a way through my faculty development workshops and things. But yeah, you know, so to get people to think about what they're doing in the classroom and reflecting on it, that's important. And that it's a cycle, that things can go wrong, but things can also be corrected. These are important things. So we need more instructional design at the university level, directly taught to faculty. Now, a lot of you, maybe you're coming through English language teaching, and so you've talked about teaching in the process of your preparation to become a teacher, but a lot of fields, they don't do that as much. You just kind of get your PhD or your graduate degree, and then you go into the classroom and sink or swim. But I think if we actually work with people a little bit ahead of time, and some programs do. For example, in Australia, I got one of my master's degrees in Australia, and so I'm a little familiar with the system there, but they now have a system whereby if you're going to become a university educator, you have to take a course during your first semester at the university where you talk about lesson planning and instructional design and assessment and all of that. And I think that's very good because, you know, there are 2 different things going on. You can become an expert in a field, but that does not mean that you know how to effectively teach other people about that field. They're kind of 2 different areas of you know, effort there. And so I think, yes, we should emphasize a little bit more university education, instructional design. Well, I think I kind of answered number 3 through the presentation itself. Are there any specific methods or tools? I kind of gave you examples of a few examples of how I've utilized these instructional design methodologies in different settings, in different situations, even at different levels of education, and definitely in different countries. Let's see. What do you think of the benefits of pursuing a degree in instructional design? I think it would be excellent. Now, you know, do you want to use it for the educational environment, like working on materials and things for K-12 education or university? That's fine. But also it can be used in industry. It can be used in all sorts of settings. So I think it's a very solid degree to have. We were just talking about the degree, like a master's in instructional design. but I think it's useful for everybody to become aware of instructional design and study it to some extent. I was introduced to it kind of in the process of my preparation when I got my post-baccalaureate teaching license, but it was basically kind of enveloped in this idea of how to write a lesson plan, how to come up with a unit that. I wish they actually said, this is instructional design. Then I would have, lights would have gone on. But I became more aware of instructional design as I went through my career. And definitely when I started teaching teachers, and graduate programs in the Middle East, I had to really emphasize instructional design for them. Do you have any tips for creating effective online courses? Oh, yes. The first tip I will give you is that good teaching in the classroom is oftentimes the same type of ethos as good teaching in online, and that you need to have a feedback loop, that you need to check to see that your scholars are understanding, that you need to, chat functions are great. I utilize that a lot, but always make sure that there's some feedback loop. Now, today I didn't do so much, right? Because it was, I thought, going to be a webinar, so kind of one way, but oftentimes there's an opportunity for interaction. Even this question and answer sheet is an excellent example of a feedback loop. Have your young scholars, I do workshops on things called, kind of ways of seeking, kind of doing these small assessments on your students, even within the context of the class as it's going on, to see if they're understanding what they're learning. So there are different ways to do that for different levels, whether it be elementary, junior high, high school, or university. So you can do those sorts of things, but make sure that you are keeping people engaged and that you are double checking their understanding as you would in a regular classroom. Okay. What is the most effective way of practicing instructional designers for the English language teachers at tertiary level? How do you measure its effectiveness? I think the effectiveness should be measured by not only what the young scholars have as output, but also one thing we don't do enough of at the university level, even the high school level, is ask the kids, the young scholars, for feedback on the lessons that we are delivering. Are they understanding? I have one faculty member who he teaches French and Latin, and he, at the end of every lesson, he hands out a little piece of note paper to everybody and has them just answer a question about the lesson, about what they understood or what they were still not understanding, and he collects those every time. So the kids always have the sense of, I can express myself, and the teacher gets valuable information about how the lessons are going, and can also gives the idea to the young scholars that, hey, this is a process. That the professor needs to know from them how things are going. So I like the whole dynamic of that. Okay. So what are the other questions here? Let me just see. How will University Online Teach be suited for taking online exam systems? We're still trying to figure out online exams. We have entrance exams we've been doing online. We have all sorts of things that we've been forced to put online over the last 2 years. So we're still trying to figure that out, to be honest. There are better software out there. Our university actually purchased a software system for us to conduct our entrance exams on, kind of a closed system. And so all I can say is technology is constantly changing. And fortunately, we have a lot of smart people working in the tech sector, and a lot of them are focusing on education. So things have been improving. Let's see, don't you think giving interesting topics will help learners to increase their motivation? As a result of that, they will be interested to write more. Yes, you could. If you come up with topics that they're interested in, you can also have them brainstorm topics if it's going to be a creative writing course, or even if it's not, if they just need to write an essay on a topic, why not get them together and have them make lists of topics that interest them, that they think their peers would find interesting, and make it an action of creativity as well as part of the process of brainstorming. And since most of the high schools will not allow teachers with such personal freedom of choice, oh, that one I already had there. Okay, and I already talked about that one. Let me go down here. How can we integrate assessment effectively, not necessarily in terms of tests or quizzes, in the instructional system design and recent digitized instruction? Okay, I would say it again. I'm not going to try to tell you exactly what to do, but if you look around in the digital world, whether it be Quizlets, whether it be these, well, somebody showed me the sticky note thing, whether it be, there are all sorts of free websites out there now that you can utilize, as well as even within the Zoom system. They now have polls you can do, they have the whiteboards, you have the chat function, you have things that you can do even with Zoom to try to get the interaction there. The interaction will be, for you, a wonderful tool of assessment. If you're asking questions and there are questions, that's good. That means that people are paying attention, thinking about the material, and they're asking questions in the chat function, for example. So I think we should actually take heart from what we've learned from the pandemic as far as technology. Some of you, and I like to tell people this, I'm kind of a dinosaur that learned how to use the computer. I was never a techie. I was never a person who was like an early adopter of technology. I saw it as useful. I was suspicious sometimes, when they were saying, "Oh, use this in the classroom. This is a great, computer program." I said, "Yeah, but this, that." But with the pandemic, I had faculty members who have really never used their computers for more than email. And suddenly they have to rely on Zoom and on Ames or Moodle system, and they're using it changed the whole discussion of technology in the classroom. And now teachers are proficient at it. We say we're going to have a Zoom class. It's almost like, oh, good, thank goodness. I know how to run Zoom. So I think we can take heart from all of this experience. I think it was useful. And I think that we can now, our challenge, as I tell my faculty, and we've got about 75 faculty that I'm in charge of, is to figure out how to take what we've learned from the pandemic and from our interaction in the online world and apply what we can to the in-person classroom experience. And so that's the new challenge as we go back to the classroom. We shouldn't shut the door on everything we learned. We shouldn't just say, oh, thank goodness, no more Zoom, no more this, boom, here we are back in the classroom. Here's the chalk. No, I think faculty are actually understanding that, hey, we learned a lot and we were able to do a great deal. And I don't want to just get rid of everything. I mean, how can I integrate technology effectively in my classroom? And so that's our challenge now. As a faculty, I can tell you that's what we're trying to deal with right here at AIU. What's another question? Several universities provide master's, doctoral degrees in instructional design. Yes, they do. While others provide degrees in learning design. How are the two programs different? I think I explained that at the beginning. Learning design tends to be on a smaller basis in my experience. You're talking about kind of smaller things, and it's specifically also deals more so with the learning environment in traditional academia. Instructional design is a little bit more expansive, looks at systems and systematic things. Yes, we can use them to think about lessons individually, but it tends to kind of be more expansive, thinking about the bigger picture. And often will involve more than just one or two people. It will be it could be systematic changes. And also instructional design is not just used in a traditional academic setting. It can be used in industry. It can be used by the government, by the military, by any time you have to teach people something. You're going to be using instructional design to come up with a system to do that instruction. How can we minimize the challenges regarding the instructional design when students switch from a teacher-centric approach to a student-centric approach? Wow, that is, of course, one thing that we worry about and deal with at AIU. And I don't know if you can minimize the challenges from that. Going from a teacher-centric to a student-centric, but what we've tried to do at AIU through instructional design to develop the the showcase, to develop the liberal arts, workshops, to change the mindset of the young scholars to think of themselves as scholars rather than students. So they have a paradigm shift. That old term from the 1980s, 90s, a paradigm shift is important. Okay. All right. I know that I'm out of time. And so I should probably bring that to a close. I want to thank you. Also here, everybody, I'm just going to share, this is my work email address. Make sure I typed it right. Yes, yes, yes. Okay. I will be honest, I'm flying to the Middle East on Monday, and I'm kind of getting ready for that. I've got a project I'm working on there with some academics, and so I'm going to be in Sharjah, which is right next to Dubai, all of next week. But if you want to send questions, I will answer them. I have reflections. I will think about them. I just might not be able to respond next week, but I will try to respond. Okay, so I just before we close up, I want to thank everyone who organized this today. I appreciate the opportunity to come and talk to you again. I appreciate the fact that there is interest in faculty development, and this continuous, faculty development, I think is a good thing. It's something that we try to do here at AIU through our faculty development, staff development programs. But, it is a challenge. Everybody's busy. We are very busy as educators. So I do appreciate the fact that you took some time from, well, your morning, my afternoon, to join us today. So thank you again. And now I'll turn it over to whoever I should turn it over. I don't know if it's Chowdhury Sensei.
Patrick, this is Lady.
Okay, very good. Go ahead, please.
Hi, I'm actually in Australia right now.
Oh, okay.
It was a very, very interesting discussion, or what you talked about. We've learned a lot, and I'm really proud to say that working for BRAC University has given us the liberty to do a lot of work. Maybe we did, at least I wasn't aware of that it is instructional design, but we have been working in a lot of similar things that you've talked about today. And so a lot of things are familiar, a lot of things are new. And I think this is very exciting that we can use these skills and discuss among our faculty. We have about 50 faculty working in BRAC University on language teaching. And they're all very creative, and they're all very excited to do new things. And I think this will come to a great use for all of us. Thank you, Patrick, for always being there for us, for any advice we need, or, so very grateful.
You're welcome. You are welcome. I always like to talk to faculty. As I said, I've been basically my whole career has been in education. I've been a teacher since the first day I left the university. And so I like working with and talking to and learning from fellow academics at all the different levels. I learned from elementary school teachers. I learned from junior high teachers, high school teachers, university level, graduate, everything. So it's always good. So thank you. Okay.
Thank you very much, Patrick.
You're welcome.
It's always a pleasure. So we all have Patrick's email address. So if anyone wants to ask him any questions, look for advice or some suggestions or some explanations, we can always reach out to him. He's very helpful and very prompt whenever he's not utterly engaged in something important. So thank you very much, everyone. And unless someone would like to add a last minute inquiry or a comment.
Okay.
This has been wonderful.
Right.
We have a lot of, we had a lot of different participants from a lot of different institutions. We are very, very glad that you could join us. We are very, very thankful for joining us today. For future workshops or webinars, you will be notified through email, and you can always look into our Facebook page for any updates and all new kinds of projects or webinars that we are going to offer. So thank you very much, everyone, once again. And if anyone has any suggestions regarding any kinds of workshops that you would like us to focus on, or you have a suggestion that we could do a workshop that you'd be interested in, feel free to write to us and we will try and arrange for that as well.
Okay.
So with that, thank you, everyone.
Thank you,
Have a good day.
everyone.
Thank you, Patrick, for the wonderful session.
Patrick, again.
Oh, you're welcome. You're welcome. I enjoyed it. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Patrick. Thank you very much.
Okay. All right. And I unfortunately have a meeting coming up, so I'm going to have to step away. But it was good to see all of you. So thank you very much. And thank you for the invitation. Okay. All right. Bye now.
Yeah, goodbye.
Have a good day.